All right, what's going on, my fellow YouTubers? Today we are going to be talking about my restored K-5 that I restored myself. A family member of ours from our church gave the locomotives to me. I have about 3 of them, and 2 of them are waiting restoration. But here we're going to be reviewing. We're taking a closer look today at my K-5 Pacific, built in 1949. So let's go ahead and review it. So anyway, when I got the locomotive, they were all disassembled. This one was in somewhat pretty good condition. It was in terrible condition when I got it, but the paint job on it's still original. So this locomotive here, we'll show you everything that's on it too. And so we're going to take a closer look at this engine that we're holding up here in front of the camera. So let's go ahead and start the review. All right, so now this is a 462 type locomotive, built in 1949. It was one of the last steam locomotives built for PRR, and it was retired 10 years later in 1959 on March 12th. So anyway, let's go ahead and start taking a closer look at the engine. We're going to go into a little bit of depth about this locomotive and why it's a successful freight locomotive, but not the best passenger locomotive. All right, so to start off here, we're going to take a look at the front of the engine. You can see here, this is the front. Sorry, you can't see it too well. Anyway, you got your PRR number plaque right here. Number 5698 is this locomotive. And then here you got your bell up front. You've got the headlamp here. Just so you know, the boiler on this locomotive is a lot bigger than that of the K4 Pacific. Now, if I had any K4s and it was restored, I would have brought down a K4, but I don't have any. I just have K5s that I'm restoring right now. This one is fully restored. I went ahead and restored it myself to active service, and I put this locomotive shown here on a test track, and it turned out the engine ran pretty well. And I went and restored this locomotive back a couple months ago. I've restored it. So here's a side view of the engine. I don't have the number strips on it yet because I do my own custom road numbers. I have a special font that I use for that. It's the same font that you see on Norfolk Southern engines, like the -9s. I got myself all of the numbers, so I go ahead and do my own custom numbers on these locomotives. And then here's a look at the paint job. I don't know if you can see it too well, but this is a black locomotive. It's actually like a very dark gray, but it's technically black. It's just faded black. So here's a look at how a steam locomotive works. So I don't have the tender with me at this time, but we're going to show you how a steam locomotive works now that we've overlooked it a little bit here. Also, one more custom I've added to the engine is my own custom builder's plate. I don't know if you could see that very well. I can't really read that. The camera's not focusing too well on it, so that's okay. All right, so I'm going to set the engine down for this so you guys can see. Just laptop here. All right, guys, so I'm going to turn the light on here so you guys can see better how it works. All right, so there we are. We're looking at the locomotive up close. You can see this one's K5, built in 1949. So here I'm going to do this. That way you guys can see it a little bit better. You don't have to really angle the laptop down so much. But anyway, I'm just using my Space Encyclopedia as a platform so we can show you how it works. So basically this squarish part here on the top of the engine is known as a Belpaire firebox, first invented in 1860 and mostly used on British steam locomotives. But it became a standard on all PRR locomotives ever since the first one was built, in the 1900s, which is the 20th century. So here we're going to show you how a steam locomotive works. Now, I don't have the tender, though, but coal is the primary fuel source. So what happens here is this one's a hand-fired locomotive. The fireman who works in the cab here shovels coal into the firebox. And what he does is when he's first lighting the fire, he actually puts a match in the firebox to set all the coals on fire that are in the firebox. And what the fire does, and also this is what the superheating here is for, your boiler tubes. Some locomotives had superheaters. An example of a locomotive being restored with that technology is PRR 1361, which looks just like this locomotive, but it's slightly smaller because it's a K-4. It's not a K-5 like this one here. So what happens is the fireman shovels coal into the firebox, and then he sets the coals alight in the morning when they're getting ready to start work. And what that does is the heat from the fire travels through boiler pipes inside the boiler. And what that does is the boiler is filled with water. And what that will do is it fills the steam, or the water starts getting very, very hot, and it starts boiling, which builds up pressure inside the boiler, also known as PSI, which means pounds per square inch. So what happens here is when that steam goes through into the boiler, it gets directed. The superheating here gets directed into the smoke box, and there's a smokestack. In Britain, they call it the funnel, and then some other countries there's special names for it in their language. But here, what happens is the major part is the movement of the wheels. So what happens is when that hot steam gets directed into the smoke box, what that does is it gets forced down into the cylinders here. This one here is your steam injector timing valve. That's in the top cylinder here. And then in the bottom cylinder is your piston rod, which therefore drives the wheels. So what happens is here's where the valve gear comes into play. So basically, this locomotive is Walschaerts valve gear. So what that does is the valve gear itself, shown here on the locomotive, connects to the radius rod. And when the valve gear moves back and forth, what that does is it actually moves the radius rod, which therefore opens either side of the intake where the steam is into the cylinder. And that's in the top cylinder, as I said earlier, that's your steam injector valve. And what that does, it slides back and forth, allowing steam to flow into the cylinder on this side, which pushes the piston backward, which therefore makes the rod go into this position where it's at now. And then when it closes off, then this side opens, steam will flow into the cylinder like this, and then push the piston the other way. And therefore, the Walschaerts valve gear times that perfectly. Therefore, these locomotives can operate without a problem. What they've added to steam locomotives since the 1920s, or is actually since way early in the 1900s, they've added what's called the eccentric crank. And what that does is here's the crank itself, which is connected to the piston rod, and it's shown here on the second pair of driving wheels because it's a 462 Pacific type locomotive. And what that does, it connects to this rod here, which therefore connects to the valve gear, allowing it to move like this. So I'll show that here. So actually it will go like this and allow the locomotive, and that's what times your steam injection, and therefore that's how a steam locomotive works. Then the exhaust, gets shot out of the smokestack here, and that's basically what happens. And here's a fact. When a steam locomotive works harder, it makes a better draft on the fire, therefore giving more power to the locomotive, and that's what allows the fire to burn hotter. But now a lot of people have been asking me this question: why does this locomotive have the Bel Pair firebox, and why is it so big? Well, here's the answer. What happens is steam locomotives burned anthracite coal, and they needed a wide firebox, therefore allowing the anthracite coal to be burned efficiently. So they started off with the camelback, where the cab was right in the center of the locomotive, and the fireman actually stood under a shelter and shoveled the coal into the firebox. And bunkers weren't even invented back then, so I don't blame the firemen for having a difficult job to do. But the Belpar firebox was a better solution. RBMN also used the wide firebox, which didn't work out as well because it was very wide and the cabs were cramped. Well, this locomotive here, you have your standard full-size cab, and the mechanical arrangement allowed for the large Belpar firebox, but it also allowed for the cab to be placed at the back of the locomotive, just like on any other steam locomotive. So that and then if you're wondering what the domes are, this is your steam dome, where your throttle control is. And what happens is inside the steam dome, when the throttle opens like this, it allows the steam to flow through there into the smoke box and down into the cylinders. So we'll show you here on this side. So what happens, the throttle valve opens, steam begins flowing into the cylinder, and what that does goes down the smoke box and into the steam injection chamber, which is the top cylinder here. And then the bottom cylinder is your piston. All right. And then this is your sand dome here. And these lines here that run down the side of the boiler are actually your sand lines, which run to your rear driving wheel here, and then your first pair driving wheel up front. So therefore, driving wheel pairs 1 and 3 have sand lines. So that basically does it for this video. And if you're wondering what this box is here, this is your feed water heater. Okay, now someone did mention in a video that they did of their custom K-5, or of their K-5 from Keyports imported, and this locomotive, and they had a question about this box here on the top of the engine, but this is known as your feed water heater. So in one of my other videos, I'll find that user that asked that question, and I'll let him know what the answer is. And then I'm not sure what this does here, so if you guys could comment down below what this little part is in front of the smokestack does, that would be great. And here's just one more quick view of the front of the engine. I'm going to lift it though so you can see the front of it better. You can see there's your, kind of see that better. It's just the front. But anyway, that does it for this video. All right, so that does it. I hope you guys like this video on how a steam locomotive works. And we'll see you in our next video.